Uh, Before I would start Professor Vinod Pavarala's talk, we'll introduce him. Professor Vinod Pavarala is Senior Professor of Communication and Dean, Sarojini Naidu School of Communication, University of Hyderabad. After completing a dual Masters in Communication and Journalism and Sociology as well, he obtained his PhD from the University of Pittsburgh, USA. Professor Pavarala is one of the main architects of the community radio movement in India. He has 3 very important and most cited books published by the internationally reputed publishing house like Sage and Routledge. He also holds the only UNESCO chair on community media at University of Hyderabad. Before joining University of Hyderabad, he taught at Pittsburgh University and IIT Bombay as well. He has multiple journal articles and book chapters to his credit. His teaching and research interests are in the areas of communication for social change, community media, community radio, and participatory communication for development as well. Now I would like to invite Professor Pavarala to initiate his talk. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Hope I'm audible. Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Thank you. So thanks for inviting me to speak in this talk series. Let me share my screen so that I can start. Okay, is that visible, the presentation? Yeah. Yeah, I hope it's visible. So my talk is about intangible outcomes of communication for social change. I will draw from some of the work we have done on community media over a long period of time, but focusing much more on this idea of intangible outcomes in the work that we do on communication for social change. Now, what do I mean by intangible outcomes? So when there is a directed, goal-directed social change communication process put in place, it wants to bring about some concrete changes in society, in a community, and so on. Most of those tend to be tangible benefits and tangible outcomes that people want to be able to see clearly, be able to measure. When people talk about impact and so on, they focus mainly on the intangible outcomes. What I'd like to do today is to draw from a chapter in a book that I had done last year about this idea called intangible outcomes, which is not so concrete. These outcomes are not so concrete. They are fluid consequences of social change, but I am making an argument here that in social change communication, we need to look closely at the intangible outcomes. Yeah. Okay. The idea of intangible outcomes first occurred to us, to our research team, during field work that we did in the early 2000s on community radio in India. In some of the interior rural areas where we did field work in Eastern India, Southern India, and other parts, we repeatedly encountered people talking about the consequences of community radio in terms that you could not easily measure, right? That the terms in which they were talking about consequences were not easily measurable. What are some of the things they were talking about? They were talking about, for example, how community radio helps foster identity, how it nurtures local language and culture, how it helps build people's capacities for self-expression, yeah? That it forges community solidarity, right? All of these are interesting ideas, interesting concepts, but not easily measurable, yeah? Also, during a recent field visit in 2019 to rural West Bengal to study the role of theater of the oppressed with, again, with our community media chair team. The role of theater in that particular project that we were studying was trying to address issues of gender discrimination. So one of the women we were talking to told us, and I'm quoting her, "We have now tasted freedom and we are not going to allow our men folk to lock us up in the house anymore." Now, this idea is so powerful, but again, this idea of gender empowerment is clearly something that is not easily measurable. Although in the long term, it may have some tangible effects. Yeah? That women become empowered in a community, eventually it may have some tangible benefits to the community. But this idea that she expressed of tasting freedom in itself is not a measurable thing easily. Yeah? So there is a enormous scholarly literature. There are a lot of reports on communication for social change. It is full of approaches to studying the effects of communication, the effects of communication interventions on individual behavior in individual social change. All of them are embedded in what the well-known social change communication scholar Thomas Tuchte has called institutionalized C4D. Yeah, C4D stands for Communication for Development. It is part of this sort of institutionalized communication for development work where there is a dominant evaluation kind of an approach that is in place, right? Another scholar, Pradeep Thomas, also calls it the corporatization of communication for social change. Now, what kind of evaluation do they do? The approaches within this institutional matrix focus on the observable, the concrete, the simple, and therefore measurable outcomes measurable outcomes of social change, neglecting the more complex intangible outcomes, yeah, which are emergent, which are more process oriented, are ignored. And typically, what you see on the image is what they call a locked frame analysis. Typically, when donors fund your project, this institutionalized C4D expects outcomes and impacts to be recorded in this kind of locked frame analysis. What are the goals? What are the outcomes? What are the outputs? And what are the activities and so on? Yeah. So this kind of evaluation is based on a set of quantitative indicators and outcomes within this so-called logical framework, right? Now, this whole approach of large institutions, which are, let's say, international NGOs, donor agencies, even governments, is part of what we call a results-based management, of communication for social change, which primarily focuses on concrete results. Now, what's the problem with this, and how do we understand this obsession with something concrete, something measurable, to the neglect of what is not measurable, what is intangible? Yeah, if you look at the background and context to this, you will see that philosophers, social scientists have historically not been blind to the possibilities of intangible outcomes. If you look, for example, at the work of the well-known American sociologist, one of the father figures of American sociology, Robert Merton. Merton, in his classic 1936 essay, talked about the unanticipated consequences of social action, right? Now, this was one of the earliest such expressions used in social science research. So what he suggested was that the excessive focus on anticipated effects and therefore tangible effects comes from a strong belief in the rational model of social action, that social action is goal-directed, objective-driven, therefore it is rational action that needs to be measured in tangible ways. And it is an ignorance, he said, which is caused by the immediate interest that they have in goal-directed social action. So when you look at it, when large organizations are investing a lot of funds in education, in health, and so on, they want to be able to answer questions of cause. What has caused this change? Yeah, why are more girl children going to school? Yeah, what role does communication play a role? Right? If you are a communication for social change agency, you want to know to what extent communication has caused this particular social change, right? So many times, to isolate the cause in terms of one particular variable is quite difficult. To what extent communication has played a role, one can't clearly say, because there are many other things happening. There are policies, there are community mobilization, there is a radio station. So many things are happening. So to what extent can we attribute an increase in the number of girl children attending school in a rural area to a particular message from a development agency and how it was disseminated? Let's say we ask this question. The answer is not very simple. The answer any self-respecting scholar will give is, it depends. Yeah, it depends on the context. It depends on what you mean by communication, and so on. Similarly, you see the French economic journalist Frédéric Bastiat famously wrote about what is seen and what is not seen. And he criticized the economists for overemphasizing the visible consequences of goal-directed actions, yeah, and neglecting less visible, less conspicuous, unintended effects of social change work. So Bastiat criticized the economists who confined themselves to the visible effect, while he said the good economists consider both visible effects and also the less visible, less conspicuous effects. Yeah. Everett Rogers, whose name might be familiar to a lot of communication students and scholars, who wrote the famous book on diffusion of innovations, also wrote in that book about what he called indirect and unanticipated consequences of innovations. Sometimes they are not only unanticipated, but they are also undesirable consequences. Yeah. So Rogers in the 1960s has also flagged this idea of intangible outcomes in his own way by talking about indirect consequences. Yeah. Now, over the last couple of decades, the communication for development enterprise grew into a major substantial presence in the global development scene. There has been some acknowledgement of intangible outcomes from strategic communication, but the solutions that they have offered about how to account for intangible outcomes have been inadequate and unsatisfactory. For example, the World Bank's Development Communication Source Book says quite clearly that both tangible and intangible outcomes of communication for development are equally valid and equally relevant. It goes on to mention things like mutual understanding, empowerment, conflict resolution as outcomes that you may not be able to measure very easily, but they are significant. They are intangible, but they are very significant and defy easy measurement. And the document, the World Bank document, recommends adoption of qualitative research designs for understanding such issues. Because a measurable thing you can get in quantitative research, but the intangible outcomes, maybe you should do qualitative research. While quantification of intangible outcomes is perceived as one solution, so some scholars some scholars have talked about creation of proxy indicators. So what is a proxy indicator for gender empowerment? That more women are attending community meetings. Yeah, and you can count that. How many women are attending, how many meetings, and so on. But is gender empowerment only about attending meetings? That is the problem with proxy indicators. But some people have suggested how to create something concrete out of an intangible idea, like gender empowerment or mutual understanding, and so on. The philosopher Alfred North Whitehead had famously called it the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. By defining gender empowerment as the number of times women are attending meetings, it's making it a concrete way of measuring, but it is a fallacious, a misplaced way of concretizing a more intangible idea, right? So multilateral institutions, international NGOs are somewhat ambiguous and somewhat unsure about it. So on the one hand, they talk about the relevance of intangible outcomes, and they struggle with ways of making tangible the intangible, right? Tangibilizing the intangible, in other words. Yeah? Now, why is this obsession with tangible, measurable indicators? The author Sally Engel Merry, who has a wonderful book on the seductions of quantification, Merry provides a strong critique of the overwhelming preference for quantitative data that suggests what she calls an epistemological bias, a bias for evidence-based research, right? So there is an entire global governance discourse of which international NGOs, donor agencies are a part, where there is a requirement for accountability, right? So funding agencies demand accountability. So in order to show that the funding you have received has concrete consequences, there is a push to produce empirical quantitative data to show the impact of your work. Yeah. So this accountability is upward accountability of communities to international NGOs, to donor agencies, and so on, who have greater power. Of course, there's quite a bit of criticism of this idea of accountability. You talk about grassroots organizations, those who believe in participatory communication, and so on. Instead, emphasize downward accountability to communities, to people at the grassroots. But the global governance discourse has a particular idea of accountability, which is an upward accountability, which demands tangible, measurable outcomes within a structure which has governments, international donor agencies, multilateral organizations, policymakers, and so on, who constitute a regime of power, a regime of domination of the domain. And they basically operate in terms of targets, benchmarks, indicators. So you know, right? I mean, with vaccination, it's about targets. With any other, for example, in the program on sanitation, it is about the target of how many toilets one can install in a given period of time in a particular area, and so on. Yeah. So this regime of power operates on this kind of tangible, measurable outcomes with targets, benchmarks, indicators, and so on. So are the indicators always value neutral, politically unbiased? There seems to be a feeling that numbers don't lie, that if produce quantitative indicators, they are somehow value neutral, free from subjective judgments, and that they are politically unbiased. Yeah, I mean, what happened with data manipulation during the entire COVID pandemic in the last couple of years, not only India, but in many other parts of the world, we know quite well that numbers can also be manipulated, that numbers cannot be taken at face value, right? So the task of indicators, quantitative indicators for intangible outcomes, is to somehow tame, domesticate the intangible, and somehow produce a concrete measure of otherwise complex concepts. Yeah? So let me give you another example. Many of you know about Bhutan and the idea of gross national happiness, right? Probably the only country in the world that has something like a gross national happiness index, not just GNP or GDP, like mainstream economists suggest, but Bhutan wants to know about the well-being of its people in terms of their happiness. Yeah. Now, there is a lot of romance attached to Bhutan's happiness assessment of its people, but if you look closely at the gross national happiness, like we have done, the idea of happiness and the idea of measuring happiness somehow invokes a society that is in a permanent state of bliss. You know, it's wonderful small society that looks at the happiness of people, not just about quantitative improvements and so on. However, this apparently intangible idea of happiness has been successfully broken down into 9 different domains. Yeah, it's not so simple as asking people, are you more happy now than last year? Yeah, that is also there, but they actually do a very systematic measurement in 9 different domains, including the psychological well-being of people, their health, how they use their time, education, culture, good governance, ecology, their living standards. These 9 different domains are broken down into 33 different indicators, which in turn are broken down into hundreds of variables. Yeah, it's not a simple way of asserting people's happiness. Data is then collected from about 8,000 sample households in all across Bhutan. So the process of ascertaining the degree of happiness of the Bhutanese people is driven by standardization. And a Bhutanese radio show host has been quoted in an article, lamenting that the concept of happiness has been quantified to a degree that makes it unrecognizable to ordinary Bhutanese. Yeah, I mean, like I said, 33 indicators, hundreds of variables, and so on. Ultimately, happiness, I mean, you take away the essential idea of happiness from it. And asserting that the concept of happiness is rooted in the Buddhist ethos, this radio show host, asserted quite simply that you don't quantify Buddhism, which is an intangible idea. Right? Now, in the same article, a noted Bhutanese filmmaker insisted that happiness is an abstraction that defies quantification. So Bhutanese government felt compelled to measure the idea in terms of certain tangible goals. So the construction of such composite indices to make up for happiness, for example, is problematic because of the subjective decision involved in giving different kinds of weightage to various aspects of well-being. How much weightage does health get? How much weightage does community vitality get? And so on, which is based on some subjective judgments, right? So it is unclear whether the dimensions and weight given to aspects of Bhutan's gross national happiness reflect a consensus on the value system of the Bhutanese people. No, maybe not. Of course, the search for a anyway, leave me there. I mean, leave it there. So this is a good example of something that is very intangible, like happiness, and how the Bhutanese government has sort of broken it up into quantitative indices. Let me give you another example which might make clear what I want to say here. The Swedish International documented a case of measuring, one case of measuring the immeasurable. In this case, they wanted to measure the concept of empowerment in the context of Bangladesh. Now, the organization acknowledges the argument that outcomes are intangible, contextual, individual, that they are behavioral, and many of these things are fundamentally unquantifiable. Yeah, it says all of that. It goes on to offer what it calls a quantitative analysis of qualitative assessment of outcomes and impacts, right? Like a paradox, offering a quantitative analysis of qualitative assessment of outcomes and impacts. Robert Chambers, one of the father figures of participatory communication, called this a methodological breakthrough. Yeah, and I have some problems with this. The project came up with indicators through a participatory process, which the participants could use to assess themselves, eventually leading to quantification. Now, while suggesting the empowering potential of participatory assessment by community members, Robert Chambers makes the assertion that one can convert qualitative dimensions into reliable and valid statistics. Yeah? So I have a problem with this, right? Now, locating the work within this framework of what I called results-based management, the CEDA, authors of the CEDA report offer what they call robust evidence that goes beyond case studies and anecdotes. Because the regime of power that I mentioned earlier, consisting of donor agencies, governments, international NGOs, and so on, demand evidence-based, outcomes. Yeah, and what they mean by evidence needs to go beyond case studies, needs to go beyond what they think is anecdote, and that is the reason they want to quantify. Yeah. Now, this compulsion to produce quantitative indicators is a function of a technology of knowledge production. It is also a function of a system of governance that tries to submerge local experiences, subjective community engagement with social change, wanting to reduce all of that into quantitative, universal, standardized categories, because large multilateral agencies want to be able to also compare countries across the world, compare different states and provinces, and you can do it more easily, they say, if you have quantitative numbers. Yeah? So the search then is to capture intangible outcomes of communication for social change without robbing its conceptual richness, like happiness broken down to 9 domains, 33 indicators, and so on. So the methods that I am suggesting, which one could draw to account for intangible outcomes in social change communication, if you want to talk about the impact of community radio or community media, if you want to go beyond the tangible, the quantifiable, the measurable, and also look at intangible things like empowerment, solidarity, pride, and so on, you need to draw on what social scientists call the interpretive paradigm, right? Do we have some more time? You want me to wind up in a few minutes? How much time do we have?
Sir, please continue, sir. Please continue.
Yeah, we have a few more minutes, right? Yeah. Let me. So this interpretive paradigm in social sciences is opposed to what we call the positivist paradigm, which led to quantitative research, empirical research that relies on numbers and quantity, right, to do research. Interpretivist paradigm, on the other hand, emphasizes how actors, meaning people in reality, construct meaning through interaction with each other, intersubjectively. They make sense of the world in which we live through interaction. Now, in the development and social change sector, this need for capturing intangible outcomes becomes very clear in the context of human rights-based approaches that have become very visible since the 1990s. So the results-based management approach, which I have been critical of during this talk, which emphasizes upward accountability to regimes of power, is more based on tangible and measurable outcomes. Scholars like Lenny and Taki have instead underlined the importance of participatory approaches, approaches that rely on learning and on complexity, not simple, but complex ways of understanding outcomes of social change. Yeah. Now, if you talk about human rights approaches, you begin to think that you need to understand power relations, you need to understand political dynamics, in various projects. Now, so if you want to understand the outcomes of communication for social change, there is little doubt that the processes must include grasping both the tangible and the intangible. While the tangible somehow goes through objective indicators and tries to measure results, it is the intangible that challenges researchers and evaluators. Now, one of the things that scholars have been saying is listening to the voices of the excluded people, listening to the voices of the marginalized on the basis of class, race, caste, gender, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and so on. What Tanya Dreher calls the politics of listening. In the kind of top-down, results-based management of social change communication, there is not much scope for listening. So Dreher emphasizes receptivity, recognition of people's voices, and responding to them with policies that are that take into consideration their voice. So if methodologically all that one is interested in is to recognize and measure predetermined tangible results of social change communication, then there is no imperative to listen to people, to listen to other voices. Now, I would like to argue, extending Dreher's idea of institutional listening, that failure to account for intangible outcomes emerges out of not only political indifference to democratic participation, indifference to social justice, but there is also a complete disregard for marginalized knowledges. If you want to listen to marginalized communities, indigenous voices, Adivasi voices, of Dalit voices, and so on, who have been systematically marginalized for decades, you need to not only foreground democratic participation, social justice, but you also need to have a healthy respect for their knowledge, for marginalized knowledges. And there are scholars, I won't go into details, but there are, for example, the Portuguese sociologist Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who talked about how dominant knowledge systems have submerged the knowledge systems of tribal communities, indigenous groups, Adivasis, and other marginalized people, treating them as if they don't have any knowledge and that they are always at the receiving end of dominant knowledge conveyed by the agents of social change communication, right? So he demands that social justice be combined with what he calls cognitive justice. Cognitive justice would mean respecting the other people's knowledge, especially that of the marginalized. Now, this idea of respect for the other's knowledge is very central to studying the intangible outcomes, taking it into consideration. If you look at India's development program since independence, whether it is the Green Revolution, the family planning programs and others, always involved centralized planning, rational bureaucracy, policy makers, experts, change agents, systematically trying to seek certain tangible benefits. Now, it may have helped the country in different ways, but in the process, we have lost the ability to take into consideration the intangibles. And more recently, critical approaches to development, such as the idea of human development in Amartya Sen's work, and he talks about capabilities approach. This capabilities approach, in many ways, allows us to look at the intangible of people's capabilities and in various ways, right? Not just tangible development that you can measure. So Amartya Sen talks about development as freedom, development as liberation and emancipation. That also invokes the ideas of eminent scholars like Paulo Freire, right, who talked about development as liberation and freedom from material injustice. Yeah, basically freedom from oppressive thinking. Right now, while this idea of human development has come about some time ago, not very recently, it's been around for a while, UN agencies and other international NGOs still persist with a lot of measurable indicators of change. So there is a persistence of what I call the methodological conservatism. People, while talking about social justice, while talking about people's participation conceptually, still hold on methodologically to older methods of studying only tangible benefits, only tangible outcomes. So what I'm calling for is kind of an institutional shift to a participatory paradigm of development and development communication. But along with that conceptual shift, one also needs to make a methodological shift if you want to understand what are the intangible outcomes of social change communication, like community media for social change, community radio for social change. So the hope is in developing participatory indicators like some scholars have suggested. We at the UNESCO Chair on Community Media have also developed some tools where we can do more participatory evaluations involving communities. A more empowering research approach, which is more like an inclusive dialogue. Yeah, like you see this image, sitting down with people and having a dialogue with them. And this requires that organizations make a shift in their approaches, in their mindset. The intangible outcomes of communication for social change, accounting for them in practices of evaluation are not only ethically warranted, because if you don't look at the intangible outcomes, you are also doing injustice to communities, right? But it is also methodologically an important thing to do, not just stop at the tangible, but also look at the intangible outcomes. So I am making an epistemological argument that you need to account for people's experiences and people's knowledge and not stop at measurable quantitative indicators. And I'm also presenting a political argument that only when you look at the intangible outcomes can you factor in the voices at the margins, can you factor in social justice and equity. Yeah, let me stop there and see if you have any questions or comments. I'll be happy to take for some more time. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your wonderful talk. I would like to Rudra Das for a quick comment, please. Rudra, please
Maybe
unmute.
he has some connectivity problems. Or...
Hello, Dr. Jana, am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Vinod, for your wonderful deliverance on the topic, said topic. I'm really sorry for the technical glitch in the Professor Pavarala is one of the giant minds of the global repute and highly appreciated scholar among communication and social change and community media as well. Sir, you raised global governance and accountability and solidarity and interpreted paradigms of social sciences, participatory development in a way to look forward for engaging ideas about intangible outcomes, regime of power and methodological breakthrough, one major ideas about political dynamics and marginalized knowledge as well. Result-based and action-oriented research also selected agenda by transitional agencies as well. You're given examples from Bhutan and Bangladesh as well. Very fascinating, sir. Finally, we are going to ask some questions from social media. Let us take the questions. Sir, here is the first question from Facebook. What is the role of community radio in the era of artificial intelligence, and how do it address the corporate issues?
I have no idea about artificial intelligence. Community media, community radio is about reaching those who are at the margins of society, those who do not have access to a lot of technological resources, those who do not have access to the mainstream media, those whose voices are not heard in the mainstream media. Community media, such as community radio, are for them. Yeah. And it is also for such communities to be able to use community radio to talk about their issues in their language, in their voice, with their own community, to have some kind of a horizontal communication. And the challenge is for us to listen to them. The challenge is to recognize these voices that are not heard, yeah, who are struggling to speak up what is about. Yeah, I have no idea about artificial intelligence, but we must recognize people's communities' natural intelligence, their knowledge systems, and how they can use that knowledge and those knowledge systems to communicate with each other. I think there was a second part to that. I forget now. One was artificial intelligence. What was the other thing?
How can you address the corporate issues?
I don't know. I mean, community media are supposed to be a third sector media. We have public state-controlled media, and there is corporate media. Community media is a third sector media which is managed, owned by communities. Yeah. So there is not much of a role for corporations in community media.
Thank you, sir. As another question here, that is, what is the role of community radio in livelihood improvement?
Yeah, I mean, community radio is about using a medium of communication the way in which a particular community wants to use to talk about the issues that matter to them, to that community, not issues and agendas imposed from the top. Now, having said that, if a particular community feels that issues of livelihood are very important, for example, community radios that focus on fisher folk, that focus on forest dwellers, and so on, and they want to talk about the threat to those livelihoods, the way in which they are trying to sustain those livelihoods, and they want to use community media to talk about those issues, to discuss those issues, they should be able to do that, right? So if the issue of livelihoods is uppermost to the communities and they want to put that on the agenda of the community radio, then there is nothing stopping community radios to talk about livelihoods.
Thank you so much, sir. Another question that how community media played a vital role in national movements.
In national movement, what is meant by national movement? I'm wondering. I mean, do they really mean?
Sir, I think it means the independence movement.
Independence movement. Well, I mean, there are various kinds of media that were used by people in the freedom struggle to convey their message, to talk to fellow Indians in the struggle for independence. For example, there is a new fascinating book that has come out on Congress Radio, which was an underground radio station run by the Congress Party, which was used to talk about messages of protest, to talk about the colonial oppression, and so on. So radio was used quite a bit, though in a subversive underground fashion. People wrote pamphlets, they wrote underground newspapers that were often copied by hand, that were cyclostyled and circulated, and so on. If you want to talk about them as community media, in hindsight, maybe some of those would qualify to be community media, but we are talking about a period when we did not have that vocabulary, right? But people involved in the struggle, the leaders were using a variety of media to counter the British. Yeah? So I don't know whether to what extent we can call it community media, but yeah, media tools were used extensively, and I gave you one example of the Congress Radio.
Thank you, sir. Another question is knowledge and pedagogical, how not interlinked in India, inform top-down theory as major and critical policy challenges and political activism as well.
Wow, that's a lot of mix of words. No, so let me put it in the way that I understood. The kind of communication for development we had, let us say, from post-independence period in the nation building project, it was assumed that certain elites who are experts, agriculture specialists, scientists, and doctors, and so on and so forth, have all the expertise and knowledge, and they will teach ordinary people who are ignorant, who are uneducated about how to develop themselves. So I gave you examples of the Green Revolution to family planning and so on. All of these are certain kinds of models of pedagogy, which is a top-down elite model of pedagogy with the experts who apparently know everything, teaching communities who don't know anything, right? This is highly problematic. Scholars like Paulo Freire, the Latin American scholar who is hugely inspirational for participatory communication, talked about pedagogy of the oppressed. Yeah, it's not that kind of a top-down pedagogy, assuming that people don't know anything, but a kind of engagement with the oppressed people, which helps the oppressed people, such as marginalized communities, Adivasis, and so on, to realize their conditions of oppression on their own, and together try to figure out ways of getting out of those oppressive conditions. Now, this is a very liberating kind of pedagogy, not that top-down kind of pedagogy that we have used for a long time. So participatory communication demands that we have a more participatory approach to the idea of pedagogy, a pedagogy that is empowering to the people, not oppressive. Yeah, and it is those kind of pedagogies, to come back to the topic of my presentation. It is that kind of interaction, participatory pedagogies, that can extract, elicit intangible consequences of communication for social change. Yeah, going beyond the quantitative, measurable indices.
Thank you, sir. Another question by Shubham Das. Professor Shubham Das is asking how community radio addresses the epistemological violence against Adivasis by the state corporate nexus.
Community radios all over the world, especially community radios that are owned and managed by indigenous communities in Latin America, South America, in Australia, in Canada, wherever there are Aboriginal radios, indigenous radio stations, and in parts of India as well, including in the state of Odisha, there are community radio stations that to some extent are engaging with the idea of indigenous epistemologies, the knowledge systems that have been passed on from one generation to the other within the indigenous communities, how to use community radios to communicate to each other that knowledge system. Yeah, it need not be at the exclusion of other kind of knowledge systems, but the work that is happening with community media to some extent, perhaps not enough, but to some extent, is, like Shubham Das says, to counter the epistemological violence unleashed against indigenous communities by the state and by the corporations, which systematically marginalize that knowledge system. So once you allow people to speak up, once they get access to the airwaves, once they get access to storytelling platforms, then they will tell their stories, then they'll be able to foreground their own knowledge to talk about themselves. Yeah, it is happening to some extent, but perhaps not enough. So Radio Dimsa, for example, in Koraput, one of our students is studying it, and there is some effort to talk about local languages, to communicate in Desia language, to talk about local knowledge systems and so on. So there is enormous potential in community radio do what Shubham Das is asking. Yeah. Thanks for that question.
Thank you, sir. Sir, also Shubham Das is asking another question what is the role of community media by creating the public sphere in which people actively interact, debate, discuss with each other in atmosphere of life world in the neoliberal era, where so-called market or state-driven digital media rarely address the voice of unvoiced.
Yeah, again, quite a profound question. I mean, the idea of public sphere, comes from a certain understanding, very European idea of somehow a national public sphere that becomes the voice of the public, that in effect is actually the voice of the state, around which the entire nation rallies. Now, that notion of a dominant, hegemonic public sphere is, by definition, a marginalizing kind of a public sphere, where the kind of voices that you are asking, Shubham Das, do not have a scope to be heard in that dominant public sphere. For example, if you are talking about the Indian public sphere, what kind of a national Indian public sphere do you create where everybody has an equal say? Our own linguistic variety creates problems in creating one national public sphere. Now, as against that, scholars have talked about what they have called subaltern public spheres. Public spheres that are created from marginal spaces, perhaps an ADIVASI public sphere, perhaps a Dalit public sphere, and so on, that would stand in opposition to, in parallel to an elite national public sphere and interacts with other public spheres. So if you talk about a society as consisting of multiple publics, there can be multiple public spheres. So community radio, we have written in other places, is in a way to forge that alternative subaltern public sphere. Yeah, and it's not an easy task because creation of this public sphere would mean carving out a space amidst the dominant hegemonic public sphere and making your voices count. But that is the struggle for community media.
Thank you so much, sir. Anirudh Jena is want to ask some question. Over to you, Anirudh.
Hi, Anirudh.
Hello, sir. I'm sorry that I had another meeting here, so I joined a bit late.
No, please go ahead. Yeah, I didn't know you were here. I just mentioned Radio Dimsa.
Yeah. So, sir, my question is this is a discussion that we used to have always. So, when we talk of assessing or making sense of the intangible outcomes when we are doing a project or research, but particularly in the reference to multilateral agencies like UNESCO or UNICEF or WHO, whatever. So we know that they are, they are obsessed with, with ideas like assessment, evaluation, quantifying stuffs. But and more importantly, they also believe in the idea of bureaucratizing ideas like development, freedom, empowerment, participation. So as social science researchers or humanities researcher, how do you counter or how to negotiate with these so-called development agencies when you try to, come up with some solid outcomes that are quote unquote intangibles, like you said, empowerment, freedom, solidarity, so like that.
Yeah, Anirudh, I mean, we need to understand these various players in the development domain in a slightly more complex fashion and not understand the domain as consisting of people necessarily opposed to each other, as necessarily occupying spaces that are polar opposite to each other. I think it's a constant negotiation. We continue to work very closely with UNESCO. We have done a lot of work with UNICEF. Lots of excellent people there. Many of them speak the language of equity, of social justice, of participation, not in any cynical fashion. They do believe in it, right? But what happens, I think, is when it comes to accounting for social change, the imperative of what I have called upward accountability to funders, to donor agencies, and so on is so strong within that institutional matrix that it ultimately demands certain kinds of tangible outcomes that you need to show. Now, when as a social scientist, you work with some of these agencies and they mean well. I mean, this is the United Nations. I mean, if you don't have the United Nations, what else are you left with, right? Internationally, in global social change and communication, we need the UN system, but we need to engage with them and see if there are subtle ways in which over a period of time we can bring about some change. For example, the Lenny and Taki complexity model of evaluation that I was talking about, we worked with UNICEF, among others, for 3 years in a joint project to bring about some reflection and change in the way UNICEF does its evaluation. And our work presented possibilities to UNICEF of how to account for the intangible, the emergent, the more complex, and to think of learning-based outcomes rather than results-based management. Now, this wouldn't have come about if we painted people as us versus them and abandoned, working with them. So it's possible to bring about, there are spaces and there are good people everywhere who espouse the right ideas and sometimes are resistant to making methodological shifts, but one can engage and see how we can bring about gradual change. Yeah, so I wouldn't throw the baby with the bathwater. I mean, we need to continue to engage with these agencies, but because they are prominent actors in the communication for social change field, and we can't really let go of them, right? And they can't let go of academics and social change communicators like us. So we need each other.
Yeah, thank you.
I mean, slightly complicated answer, but yeah.
But fair enough.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah.
Thank you, Anirudh. Do you have any other question?
No. I can
Thank you.
always.
Thank you. Now I would like to request the director of CART, Dr. Jena, to go for a remark, and if he has some question, please, Dr. Jena.
Sir, I would love to add some submission as well, not question, because I know you are a very giant's mind of a community radio as well from Hyderabad Central University. I have a lot of strong relation with your department as well and your school, Professor Malik, Professor Usaraman, and you and Professor Basuki as well. I would just like to mention some few observations during my research when I was a communication, not exactly I'm a communication scholar, but I was a communication student as well. I would love to know from you in terms of pre-liberalization era and post-liberalization era. These people, they try to impose on this ethos of ideas, communism, nationalism, fascism, Nazism, and feminism, liberalism as well. But in terms of post-liberalization era, we saw corporatization, globalization, privatization, liberalization, digitization. Sir, what would you say about this ism versus isization, right, sir? Because you are a giant communication scholar and you pick my exact what I would like to ask you. And then the cross-culture communication via cross-media ownership as well in terms of voice poverty. Although voice poverty is a term from economic, what always arguing with me, and radio as well. When I listened the word radio, immediately I jumped into the World War II, when the Hitler and entire his team, the broadcasting team, how they propagated these missionaries, how to use this tool of communication in terms of the ideas of magic bullet theory as well. So how do you look at these serious issues in terms of magic bullet theory versus useless gratification theory? And then lastly, the death of distance, how the communication revolution will change our lives in terms of culture, in terms of social behavior, in terms of our mindsets, and in terms of our psychological norms and concern. Last but not the least, finally, I would like to say why the Indian academia always overlooked these serious issues in terms of policy frames or policy paradoxes. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thanks, Vikram. I mean, I'm taking this as comments that you are offering, and some of the questions that are implicit in your comments are such huge things that you and I need to sit across and discuss these issues. I mean, it requires an entirely different seminar altogether to talk about the shifts in communication post-liberalization. I'll only say that let us not confuse liberalization with liberation. Yeah, and I'll leave it there. And there are many complexities that emerge out of this liberalization context. We can sit and discuss. There are many strands in your comments. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah.
I would like to Rudran Das go for the formal vote of thanks. Thank you so much, sir, for wonderful delivery.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jena. And now we are going to conclude this very wonderful and thought-provoking session of Professor Vinod. Sir, thank you to be associated with Center for ADIVASI Research and Development, and your deliberations are very much important and need of the hour. And definitely you were said about so many sides of community radio and how it will be deals with the present society and how it will be solve the general or common problems of our society. Definitely your lecture is the eye-opening for all of us, for our audiences over social media and here. Thank you so much, sir, for spending your valuable time with us. And now I'd like to thank our coordinating institutions, Indian Institute of Management, Sambalpur, and Central University of Odisha, Koraput, for their cooperation, and also thanking Professor Mahadev Joyswal, Director, Indian Institute of Management, and the Acting Vice Chancellor of Central University Odisha, Professor Sharat Kumar Palita, for their cooperation, and conveners of this August conference, Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda, and eminent philanthropist Charudat Panigrahiji. And thank you, Dr. Vikram Jena, for this wonderful gathering, because it's because all of your efforts that we are here to finding, and we are here to listening the finest brains of India as well as abroad and world. And in terms of academic development, in terms of growth of academic sense in India, your cooperation and your presence in this academic scenario, it's quite interesting and important for the generation. Thank you so much for your efforts. And I would like to thank our team whose continuing and relentless effort is quite appreciable. Professor Shubham Das, Professor Ghanshyam Giri, Dr. Samuel Lima, Dr. Kamal Prasad Mohanty, Dr. Nupur Patnaik for their help and cooperation, and all the audiences that we have since 2 months with us, and thanking you all. Thank you. The meeting is concluded now.
Thank you for inviting me.